I tend to not like introducing authors at our festival, and that's really for two reasons. One, I genuinely enjoy giving other people the chance to introduce their favorite authors. I think it really is awesome to watch. And also, I generally prefer to experience our book festival meandering around the pavilions, silently simmering in my own anxieties, like a dad on a sideline watching his kid take the field for the first time. But every now and then, I am so taken by a piece of work that I am compelled, and Kathryn Schulz's book, Lost and Found, is spectacular. It knocked me off my feet, and in some ways, it changed the way that I look at the world around me. And this effect will come as no surprise to fans of her work at The New Yorker, where as a writer of features, essays, and literary criticism, Kathryn has received both the Pulitzer Prize, anyone heard of the Pulitzer Prize? And the National Magazine Award. I would go so far as to argue that Kathryn Schulz is one of the two most brilliant, erudite, elegant, and compelling writers in the state of Maryland, and coincidentally, she happens to be married to the other one, Casey Sepp, who's over there in the corner. Raise your hand, Casey. I'm not going to detour this introduction too much, other than to say that the moment she comes out with a follow-up to Furious Hours, her terrific book, she will be receiving an invite to come back here. But getting back on track, Kathryn's book, Lost and Found, is a meditation on three life concepts: the things we lose, the things that bring us together, and the things we discover or rediscover. It's also a memoir, part melancholy in Kathryn's coming to terms with the decline and ultimate death of her father, as well as part love story in finding the love of her life. Lost and Found is, at all times, observant, insightful, and gorgeous. And as an aside, before I turn this over, as mayor, you might wonder, does it bother me that the two most brilliant, erudite, elegant, and compelling writers in the state of Maryland live on the Eastern Shore and not in Gaithersburg? And I'm not going to lie, it bothers me a little bit. But we'll take what we can get. It's a huge honor to have both of them here. You're going to love getting to know Kathryn, and through Lost and Found, you'll get to know Casey as well. Let's give them a big welcome. And not to be forgotten, in conversation with Kathryn this morning is my dear friend Becky Meloan, who works at the Washington Post in the Book World section. What's also important to know about Becky is that prior to the Washington Post gig, she worked with me for a decade on this festival, recruiting authors and helping build it into what it is today. Let's welcome Becky. Let's welcome Kathryn. I'm handing it over.
Thank you, Judd. That was beautiful and unnecessary on my part, but I appreciate it. Kathryn, thank you for coming. I know you're up from the Eastern Shore, so I'd like to welcome you to the Western Shore of Maryland, as you mentioned in your book, it's called, from your part. I first want to tell you, Judd talked about your what you wrote and how great it was. I want to tell you how I felt about your writing. It's beautiful. And it flows. When I read your writing, it just flows naturally, and it feels effortless to read. It feels like when you're watching an Olympic figure skater twirling around, or you're hearing a singer. Just sometimes singers can open their mouth and just a beautiful note seems to fall out, like it's just so easy. And I know that's not easy, and what you do is not easy. But you make it appear as though the words just fall out of you and curl onto the page, and it's a pleasure to read them. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You start your book talking about the illness and the loss of your father, who sounds like he was larger than life, like he filled a room. For people who haven't read the book, can you introduce him?
I would be delighted to, but before I do that, I do just want to, speaking of introductions, I see that our mayor has already absconded, but oh, no, there he is. Thank you. That was truly one of the loveliest introductions I've ever had, and also the only one from a mayor, so I'm grateful. And I'm really grateful to all of you for being here. I know it's approximately 1,000,000 degrees, and also there's many things competing for your attention on a Saturday morning, so it means a lot that what you want to do is come out and think about books and ideas and language, so it's wonderful to be here, and I will just briefly echo Judd and say, you don't need to buy my book, but please do buy some book before you leave. Support Politics and Prose and all these wonderful indie bookstores that keep our communities of readers and writers alive. That is the end of my moralizing spiel, and I would be delighted to tell you about my dad. My dad was a really remarkable person. He was born to Polish parents in Tel Aviv in 1941. They had both fled the coming war, and by the time my father could walk, he had lost basically his entire maternal line in Auschwitz. And then subsequently for many years, he was kind of kicked around the globe by the combined forces of geopolitical violence and poverty. And then finally, his family was able to get refugee visas, and they settled in Detroit. And one of the things that was really remarkable to me about my dad certainly is that immigration story, and it's actually much wilder than that, but I'll leave the details for readers. But what was incredible to me was that he had this childhood of real trauma and violence and dislocation and deprivation, and yet he somehow emerged into adulthood as just the most joyful and generous and compassionate guy you could ever hope to meet. He was truly brilliant in both senses of the word. Brilliant. He spoke 6 languages. English was the last one he learned. He was more fluent than I could ever hope to be, and had an incredible memory and was amazingly astute about the world. But he was also brilliant the way the sun is brilliant. He would walk into a room and people would just kind of gravitate towards him. He warmed everything up. So it was such a privilege to grow up as his daughter and grow up in that kind of presence and have him sort of share his sensibility about the world with me.
I love that he's brilliant the way the sun is brilliant. That's quite the compliment and beautiful. You talk about how in your family, your father was, the theme of lost is the first section of the book, and you talk about, as far as losing things, your father was always misplacing his keys, misplacing things. And you say that he was sort of happily resigned, like his possessions weren't even his own, so he was okay with that. And that your sister was the same way, but that you and your mother were excessively orderly. I wonder what needs to be excessively orderly for you in your life.
Well, first I'll just say for those who haven't read the book, right, this first section, Lost, it's anchored in the death of my father and over kind of a meditation on losing the people we love. But it really is about the weirdness of this category of loss, the fact that we would, put my father in it, but also put, my car keys or my cell phone or an election or our faith, like all these strange things that go into this same category. And yes, part of why my father made a convenient anchor for that wasn't just that I had lost him, and it wasn't even that he had suffered these enormous losses that kind of stake out like the far end of that category, survived something like the Holocaust. But by chance, he also kind of exemplified the trivial end of this category, right? My father, for the life of him, never knew where his car keys were, or for that matter, his car, most of the time. But yeah, it was kind of this like funny thing in my family. My mom and I, to be honest, so I now have a little baby. You might hear her kind of happily chattering in the background, and possibly in part because of that, I can't claim to be quite as organized as I once was. And I myself now lose things with some regularity. But yes, my mother and I kind of held down the other end of the spectrum when it comes to like material objects. Like I'm one of these people who just, likes to have things tidy and put things back in the same place. Mm-hmm. And, which is fine, but I do think life is kind of a lesson in accepting that there's limits to how effective that is, right? Entropy is a real thing, and it disorganizes the world for us. And to some extent, I think it's important for all of our sanities to be able to accept that and make our peace with it and live joyfully in the face of all these inevitable losses, the big ones, but also the trivial ones.
Mm-hmm. So it seems having a new baby sort of shifted your perspective a little bit on the need for the control of all the things in your life that you were trying to control by putting them in order?
Well, I think actually that awareness, I hope, long predated the baby, although baby maybe caused me to instantiate it more just because I'm tracking her so much I fail to track other things. But no, I think, I wrote this book before the baby was born, and I think part of what I felt in writing it was a kind of mindfulness about this inevitability of loss and how it is that we figure out how to live a good and rich and meaningful life in the full knowledge that everything that we have, we are someday going to lose. So, no, I think, or I hope at least, that awareness is something that's been with me for a long time.
That's good. That's important. You also talk about the themes of loss in literature. You mentioned there was an Italian Renaissance poet, and all the way till L. Frank Baum had a story with Lost Things, and P.L. Travers and Mary Poppins. Why do you think that having a place to find lost items is a common theme in literature?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read this book or otherwise come across this concept, there's this wonderful kind of enduring idea in literature, and it's often called the Valley of Lost Things. That was its first appearance, or the first one that I could track, which dates to this 15th century poem. But the idea of a Valley of Lost Things is that we can't find all the things we lose, but they somehow magically find each other, right? They all wind up in the same place, and what that place is varies wildly. For those of you who saw the remake of the Mary Poppins, the one with Lin-Manuel Miranda in it, you might remember there's this song about where the lost things go, and it's on the other side of the moon. This is actually a very old idea, and I write about it some in the book because I find it very beautiful. This notion that there's some place we could go, some destination that if we got there, we would look around and we would see everything we'd ever lost and everything everyone else had ever lost. And to me, what a fantastical and fascinating imaginary journey that you would go there, and it would be like, that diary you lost in the 5th grade, and the shoulder bag you really loved that you left in a train station once, but also, Amelia Earhart's airplane, and the idea that you forgot about because you didn't write it down in the middle of the night. Like I find this idea so moving, and I think in part because, of course, it's very close kin to this other valley, right? The valley of the shadow of death. We already we have an idea of an afterlife. We have an idea that those we love who we can no longer access are at least together, somewhere. And it's quite moving to me that we extend that same beautiful notion to even the things, the material objects in our life that we love and that we lost.
I never really thought about that in terms of losing an idea. So that's a neat way to think about that. I read a story when I was a child where the kids had a magical box where they'd find everything they lost, and it always stuck with me.
Oh, an early encounter with a box of lost things. I love it.
Yeah, it's something I've always wanted since I read that book when I was little. You also write that after losing your father, you couldn't find pleasure in reading anymore, except in poetry. So why do you think you turned to poetry for solace?
It's such a good question. I do love poetry. I loved poetry long before my father died, and in fact, my father is a major reason why I loved poetry. I have this very vivid childhood memory of him kind of busting into this room where my sister and I were playing. We couldn't have been but like 6 years and 9 years old or something like that. And there he is with his Norton Anthology of Poetry, and he's like reciting Kubla Khan at the top of his voice. It's like, a 6-year-old doesn't know much about Coleridge or anything else, but it certainly made a big impression. And I really have always loved poetry. And in fact, I sort of think of this book as kind of a covert poetry anthology. There's quite a lot of poetry in it, and a real pleasure of it was getting to introduce readers or reintroduce readers to poems that have been meaningful to me. But in terms of why I could find solace and enjoyment from poetry and not from much other reading after my father died, I think that novels or nonfiction, they sort of require you to leave the rest of the world and enter their world, and just kind of give your mind and your imagination to that book for the time being. And I think I couldn't quite do it. I didn't want to be away from my grief, which I think is a dangerous but common thing that happens to us when we're grieving. You feel like it's a betrayal to be doing something else, and you kind of want to stay inside it. And I didn't have the desire or the attention span or whatever it took to kind of sit there with a novel, even a wonderful one, which was very strange for me. That's normally where I go right away when I, both for just pleasure, but also, to get away, and to be reminded of all the many wonderful things in life, including brilliant writers. But, with poetry, well, for one thing, I think poetry does an exceptionally good job with grief and with love. That's why there is so much of this in this book. And even the longest poem is shorter than the shortest novel, pretty much. And as a result, there's an enormous amount of kind of pressure per syllable, as it were, on the importance of what you're reading. And it really distills a lot of the emotional experience of life and of these momentous moments of life, like grieving or falling in love. And I don't know, I think for me it was kind of the right dose of the medicine I needed at that time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Were there particular poets that you turned to the most, or certain poems that meant the most to you?
Well, many of them do show up in the book, but, very vividly, I describe this in the book, I remember my partner reading to me Walt Whitman's beautiful poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which, if you've never read, you absolutely should, and which actually transformed for me my experience of my father's death, and in a very beautiful way just put his life in a kind of perspective for me, and that was true, of other Whitman poems I read at the time. I obviously thought quite a lot about the Elizabeth Bishop poem, One Art, which, if any of you know it, is basically, much like this book, is about the strange category of loss and, how to make sense of the fact that we lose our car keys, but also, our loved ones. So, those were a handful of them, but there are a great many more.
Had you known about that poem before, or did you stumble across it after?
No, I had already. That was an old standby in my inner anthology, as it were.
Okay, that's nice. You write about something called bereavement hallucinations, which I found very interesting. Can you tell us about your experiences with those?
Yes, my experiences with those were annoyingly non-existent, but I'll tell you what they are. So bereavement hallucinations, they're actually very common. They're shockingly common. This is when someone you love has died, and you have the very strange experience of seeing them or hearing their voice, or sometimes just feeling their presence. I'm seeing a lot of you nod, and I'm not surprised, because, as I said, they're really common. Enormous percentages of people who lose someone they love have this kind of experience. And in fact, there's beautiful studies of married couples and widows, and when one half of a couple dies, the frequency of bereavement hallucinations grows up in exact proportion to how long they were married. It's really interesting. It's like your mind just cannot believe the person isn't there, and so they, in some sense, continue to be there. Or if your cosmology allows, there's many ways to interpret this experience, obviously, and one is that loved one, the essence of them has persisted, and they're letting you know they are still there in some way, shape, or form. I had this kind of experience before my father died. I had it with both my grandmother and my great-grandmother and a childhood friend who had died. And then my dad died. My dad, who, as you probably gathered from me trying to introduce him, was like a very obvious presence when he was alive, right? And yet after he died, there was just nothing. I never heard his voice. I never felt his presence. I never saw him or had the sense of him being around me. And on the one hand, that actually does comport with my own personal cosmology. I envy people who believe that those they love are waiting for them after death, but I have never myself been able to truly feel that or connect to that. So I shouldn't have been surprised that I couldn't feel my father, and yet I was utterly heartbroken about it, and I did find myself going out kind of actively searching for him, which again, as I then learned, turns out to be very, very common behavior among the bereaved.
Okay. You do mention, and maybe the language is going to be wrong for this question, so let me see if I can explain it right. This is some more of your beautiful writing. You said, I still notice almost daily all the places where my father is missing. I come upon them in photographs and in books that I'm reading, in the sound of my own sentences and the shape of my thoughts. So I wanted to ask you, when you hear your father's voice in your head, but you say you don't actually hear his voice, but do you hear his wisdom? How do you experience that?
Yeah, it's a fine distinction, right? I've never had the feeling of, my dad kind of calling my name or saying something to me in a sort of, from the beyond kind of way. But I certainly do. Obviously, my father is invoked and evoked for me all the time. I mean, not all the time, but with some regularity. And I think for me, the two most wonderful ways that happens, one is my sister, as it turns out, is just uncommonly good at channeling my father. I have an older sister. We're very close, and she was very close to my dad as well. And she's just wonderful at bringing my dad to life, as it were. Not that anyone can ever do that, but she's really able to kind of sense like what he would say in a given moment or how he would respond to me in a given moment, and that's always very joyful for me. And the other is that every once in a while, when I'm writing, I produce a sentence and I think, thanks, Dad. It's just pure Isaac Schulz. I know that it wouldn't have come to me if I hadn't grown up with his voice and his intonations and his word choices and his sensibility right at my side all along. So that's the other and again, quite wonderful way that I sometimes experience my dad's presence.
That's a great tribute to him, that you experience sort of his voice in your writing. And you're such an amazing writer. That's a really beautiful way to have him carry on, in the world. I like that. You noticed also, and I promise we'll move on from the grieving in a moment, but I have one more question about it. You noticed that sadness is not one of the 5 stages of grief. And you wrote really beautifully about how sadness kind of wove in and out of your grieving process. You wrote, I found sadness to be, in every sense, a vulnerable thing, a small neutral nation on a bellicose continent whose borders were constantly overrun by more aggressive emotions. And you also said that the whole lesson grief teaches us is that we're not in control. It seems like you're saying that sadness has sort of a randomness to it, and that, since things that are sort of in a pattern are easier for us to cope with, do you think that's why grief is so awful? Because it doesn't follow a pattern that we know?
I think that's part of it. I think grief is fundamentally awful because we only grieve those we love, and they're gone, and we can't be with them, and it's very, very hard to make your peace with that. But it's certainly the case that one of the real difficulties about grief is, in addition to the large thing we don't have control over, which is we lost someone we love and we can't bring them back, we don't have control over all the small stuff, right? We don't have control over when we're not sad but feel that we should be, at a funeral or something. And when we are sad and it's incredibly inconvenient, you're in front of an audience of people or, whatever, you're at work, whatever it may be. So there's no question that the kind of unpredictability of grief and the fact that it also takes all these forms that, as you say, are a lot less becoming than sorrow. I think we all could be at peace with simply sorrowing over the loss of those we love. But of course, we also experience all these other things. We get annoyed, we get angry, we get bored, we, bite the head off of someone we love for no reason at all, except we're grieving and have no bandwidth for anything else. It manifests itself in us in ways that are not always sensible and not always pretty or becoming or in line with what we imagine grief would be. And I think that is a very, very difficult part of it.
Yeah, it is surprising when it pops up. You talk about the first time that Casey met your parents. And you said before the day that they met, you hadn't noticed any similarities between the two of them, but doubtless because of their far more pronounced differences. But then listening to them talk, it made you see them in a different light. How is your wife like your father?
It's very interesting, first I just want to say one thing about that scene where essentially the two main characters of this book finally meet. This is allegedly a memoir, but it's considerably more about these two people I love, my partner and my father, than it is about me. And there was a kind of satisfying thing about writing it, which is I wrote this book does not happen in the order that my life events happen. So in real life, I met my partner and then lost my father. But in the book, we meet my father and grieve my father and go through that lost section, and then we move on to love for all kinds of reasons, but chiefly I felt the trajectory of the book should be toward joy. But that structural decision had a really interesting side effect for me as a writer, and a really gratifying one, which is that after we grieve my father, after we process all my grief about him, after he's gone, and we turn the page and we meet my partner and we talk about love and we have this whole love story, this wonderful thing happens, wonderful for me, which is I got to bring my father back to life. And I got to bring my dad back to life on the page because, in fact, he and Casey did meet in real life. So the scene you're talking about is the first time these two main characters converge. And it happens in the context of a kind of idea I'm wrestling with in the book, which is how do we find love, right? How do we recognize it? How do we know what it is? And that is actually a really difficult problem, right? If you are looking for your wallet, it is not difficult to recognize it. You know exactly what it looks like. Even if you're looking for something you've never seen before, you know, like a dinosaur bone, you have a broad sense of what a dinosaur bone looks like, where it might be, you know, where these things have been found before. But if you're off looking for love, right? I mean, you don't know who it's going to be. You don't know where you're going to meet that person. It's a really, really hard search problem, right? So I wrestle with, like, well, how do we go about looking for it, and how do we recognize it once we find it? And of course, classically, one of the ways that we recognize love is it has been modeled for us, right, by our very earliest caregivers. And we often hear about this in a kind of negative sense. You know, you saw this kind of, you know, talk within psychology and psychiatry and therapeutic circles about how, you know, if you have some kind of damaged relationship with a mother or father or caregiver, it can be very difficult to find love, or you kind of recreate those patterns and love becomes this painful thing for you. But of course, it's also true if, like me, you were very lucky and had, you know, doting and wonderful parents who did everything in their power to, like, love you and tend you and give you a good life. And so, of course, you know, we recognize love from this early model, and so it should not have been surprising, and yet it was surprising to me in the moment that I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, you know, actually, yes, these two main characters of my life do remind me of each other. And as you say, that was startling in part because, right, obviously, different genders, different ages, very different self-presentations in some ways. My dad was this, like, very gregarious guy who would dominate a room, which is not the nature of my partner. But on the other hand, they were both, and obviously my partner is still very much with us, thank goodness. They, you know, are unbelievably brilliant, unbelievably kind of self-made thinkers, you know, people who in some ways found their own way to the life that they wanted, and had such a forceful intellect that they made their path in the world towards who they wanted to be. And people who just love knowledge and love learning and are genuinely observant about the world and fascinated about the world. Coincidentally, they both also have astonishing memories. I mean, almost photographic recall, and a kind of just inner clarity and fortitude that I find rare. You know, they had I think probably because both of them in many ways did educate themselves, they have very independent minds. You know, part of why I love being with my partner is she thinks about the world in ways that are constantly refreshing and interesting to me, because they don't feel glib and they don't feel parroted, and they might not be the conclusions I would reach because she's always on this kind of beautifully independent train of thought, and it's lovely to be around. So I think in the kind of core way, you know, yes, they also both loved literature and delight in language and use it interestingly, but in this kind of deep core way, I think their minds reminded me of each other. And of course, because I am who I am, like, that's how I fall in love, right? Like, straight through the prefrontal cortex. You know, it's going to be through the intellect, and so that's why and how, I mean, among many reasons, how I fell in love with Casey and a lot of what I loved about my dad. And it was beautiful in that moment to realize, like, oh, these minds have something in common, which incidentally I think they realized about each other too right away. They just, you know, got a kick out of each other from the moment they met.
Mm-hmm. Did your mother or sister ever see any similarities between them that you hadn't noticed till they pointed it out?
I think my mother did, for sure. Yeah, I think my mom did. I mean, you know, she was married to a man for 49 years. I think she knew him pretty well.
That's neat. You seem to find comfort in nature, both in reading about it and in being in it, running, hiking, camping. Why did you and your wife have your first fight about a bear?
I'm like half tempted to take your mic and hand it to Casey, and we'll relive it for you guys. No. Yes, so in the found section of this book, which is the second section of this book, which is about this kind of broad category of discovery and the joy we find in finding things, obviously the heart of that category is about the most wonderful thing I ever found, which is my partner, and quite a lot of it is just revels in telling this love story, because a love story is a wonderful thing to tell. But I did feel that it was important to, there is this fight scene in it about a black bear of all things, and it felt important to include because it was true, but also because I think, the third part of this book is about emotional conjunction and combination, as it were, the fact that our love and our grief are completely inseparable, right? And our joy and our sorrow are inseparable. And that's true on the grand scale. I said earlier we only grieve what we love, but it's true on the micro scale too, right? You can be madly in love with someone and feel that you have just the relationship you'd always dreamed of, which I do feel, and you are still occasionally going to fight with your partner or get annoyed with her or disagree about things or whatever. So it felt important, the kind of texture of reality, right? The friction of reality felt important in there. And it felt important because I was writing about difference, and I think, difference is a lot of what fuels arguments in various ways. But yes, we were in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley and out hiking for the day, and we saw a black bear, which is, it's always wonderful to see wildlife in the actual wild, and so that was marvelous and all. But this somehow turned into a debate about whether you are more likely to see a black bear if you are just out hiking for the day, if you're deep in the backwoods, like on a backpacking trip. And the chief thing I should say about this fight, I won't bore you with the details, the chief thing I should say about this fight was I was on the losing end of it. I began the entire thing with a slightly ridiculous claim. I mean, you don't need to know anything about nature or anything about black bears to be able to imagine that actually if you're in a very populous place with a lot of people who are careless with their food and there's big garbage cans all around, there's going to be a large black bear population. So I don't know what I was thinking in advancing any other kind of theory. But yes, I mean, it turns out that even the glories of nature do not always render you immune to interpersonal friction, but in many ways it's one hates to call a fight wonderful, but the reason I dwell on that fight in the book is that it illuminated, I think, for me, part of the engine of why fights happen, and therefore how to kind of take apart that engine and not fight, which, to be clear, is not to say not disagree. I think disagreement is really important. I said earlier, one of the things I cherish about my partner is her incredibly independent mind, and I would grieve it beyond measure if she always agreed with me. But part of what I was trying to kind of parse and understand via that scene was how do you disagree with someone and not let it become, which I think is what happened, not let it become a little door through which fear comes in or anxiety comes in, because those, I think, are the things that actually fuel fights and turn otherwise completely benign or interesting disagreements into actual arguments.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think fear is at the basis of picking fights. So yeah, that was very interesting. I do want to take a moment to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, there's a microphone over here. And we'd ask that you come up and ask your question there so that everybody can hear what you're saying. And don't all run at once. Looks like we have one.
Hi, Kathryn. Thanks so much. My name is Patrick. I have a question about a struggle I hear a lot of people who are writing memoirs describe, and that is, as you're composing and deciding what to put in, what to leave out, the struggle between writing the story that you think should be told and writing the story that you think people will read. And I'm wondering if that was at all a struggle for you at any point during this, especially in deciding what to put in there and what to leave out, even though it's great.
That's a great question. I did have a little bit of that struggle, but interestingly, it wasn't exactly about memoir. The question for me wasn't what from my life should go in and what should go out. Because I was pretty clear, because this memoir has this organizing principle, which is this investigation of these categories of losing and finding, it was very obvious to me that was kind of the litmus test to decide what went in. And I knew from the beginning this was a story about falling in love, and it was a story about grieving. And I had a lot of clarity about kind of what moments from my own life belonged in there. But the question of like what do people want to read is an interesting one, and I mostly, it's a fine balance as a writer between ignoring it, which I think is frankly often the appropriate response, and then not ignoring it, right? Being respectful of readers' time and attention and interest, and wanting to make a book or any piece of writing inviting to them, wanting to keep them, wanting to move from one page to the next page. So where I most had that struggle actually was with beginning this book. I had a very difficult time figuring out how to get into this book. I didn't write it in order. I already told you it's not actually in chronological order. I also didn't write it in the order it finally appears in the book. I wrote all of Found first because I'll tell you what, it is very delightful to write a love story. And that was by far the easiest and most pleasurable part of the book to write. And then you might imagine that And, this kind of curious, slightly peculiar part at the end of the book would be the most difficult to write, but actually that was also pretty much a pleasure, partly because it's a continuation of the love story, and my partner and I get married in it. And anyway, it was Lost that was hard to write, but it was not for the reasons you probably think, because it was sort of the most emotionally difficult one, and the one about grief. It was hard to write for all kinds of other reasons, including that, I had already written about my father's death, and I needed to get away from that narrative and find a new way in. But above all, it was hard to write because beginnings are difficult, and they feel really high stakes, and you want to make sure that you're starting in the right way and that people will feel compelled and will get into it. And I could not for the life of me decide whether to go in on the personal, like on my reason for writing this, which was the death of my father, or to go in on this broad category of loss that I was interested in exploring, and then come later to the personal. And I tried about a half dozen different openings, but the one I tried hardest and longest, other than the actual opening of this book, if you can believe it, it could not be more different than the actual opening. It was about Malaysia Airlines 370, which many of you might remember. That was the flight that took off from Kuala Lumpur in March of 2014 and simply vanished, basically. And for a year and a half, no one had any idea what had happened to it. And like a great many people at the time, I found this tragic and also haunting, because it was incredibly hard to wrap my head around, like, how do you lose a commercial airplane, right? It's enormous. It's incredibly well tracked, So it felt to me like it got at a lot of these questions in the book, like how what do we put in this category of loss, and how do we lose things? And I was very drawn to that opening for many reasons, but if I'm going to be scrupulously honest, one of the reasons I was drawn to that opening is I had this slight fear that my own life, while very happy, was also a little boring, and that it would not be enough to make a reader want to pick up this book and keep going. And I also authentically thought this story was interesting and important and relevant, the Malaysia Airlines one, but at some point after 7,000 words of, on the page about this, I just thought, this is wrong, right? The story of that airplane is beautiful and important on its own terms, but I should not be using it, right? I should not be using it to lure readers into this book. This is an instance where I should not be thinking about what is it that a reader wants, right? Or at least I shouldn't be answering that question via a horrible tragedy that, while relevant to this book, is not the only way in or the necessary way in, and that is actually quite far from my own life. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, yes, I did really think about that, and ultimately just kind of stayed pretty close to my gut, which is that the stories that I wanted in here were essentially stories about love, and about even in the face of grief, about happiness, right? About happy families, about ordinary families, and kind of let the chips fall where they may in terms of reader interest. But you guys are here, so I take a lot of heart in that.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience?
I'll call on you guys, so someone better come on.
Yes.
Sitting on my feet, yes. I wrote a brief memoir on my father many years after he died, in a memoir class, and basically because he only knew 7 of his 35 grandchildren. He died at age 57, and I wanted to do it for them. But the feeling I had the whole semester when I was doing this was that he was in the house with me. I mean, it was like he never left. And it was wonderful. I cherished it, but it was also a little spooky.
I can imagine, and I both slightly identify and also truly envy you that experience. You know, it was a real gift of writing this book that I was, of course, very in touch with my dad, you know, and thinking about him a lot and thinking about his life and talking. I mean, I do this anyway, but talking to my mom and my sister about him a lot, talking to my partner and my in-laws about him a lot, and that did feel like a gift. I wish I had also felt that he was kind of you know, drifting around my office, sort of advising me. I do think my poor dad, you know, I think that he'd be so proud of me, but to be honest, he'd also be really annoyed. Like, really, you waited till I was dead to, like, you know, put me in the New Yorker and publish a book about me? Like, couldn't you have done this earlier when I could enjoy it?
Yeah, thank you.
I love your book, and I just wanted to know, how do you write such personal things for the world to see? And did you struggle with, do I really want the world to know all these details about my life?
I think the answer to that question is supposed to be yes, but the honest answer is no. I am, well, several things. First of all, I'm not a terribly private person. But I certainly was mindful writing this book that other people are, and that I was telling other people's stories. My partner is a more private person than I am. I think in some ways my sister is a more private person than I am. And I was, of course, always aware that it's not that these weren't my stories to tell, it's that they weren't only my stories to tell, right? I mean, any story I tell in here is also my partner's story, or my mom's story, or my sister's story. I actually tell very beautiful stories that are truly my father-in-law and my mother-in-law's stories in this book, and I'm unbelievably grateful to all of them for just truly and graciously and generously letting me do so, and letting me do so on my own terms, and kind of championing the whole project. But to be honest, I never felt, and still do not feel, excuse me, even now that readers can kind of talk to me about it because they've read it, I never felt the kind of exposure or vulnerability that I think you often hear memoir writers talking about. And I imagine that's in part because the book is only sort of as a memoir, as I said. You know, it's not a terribly completist account of my life. Now, it is about these very momentous experiences, grieving and falling in love, but it's not like you get, you know, every detail of my life from, you know, birth to the present day. But also, I think because this is a book that is fundamentally about joy and about happiness and gratitude, and about the real love I felt in my family of origin, in the family I've made, in the family I married into. It just made a lot of things easy that I think for other memoir writers who are grappling with trauma or dysfunction or more difficult family histories, like I think all of that can be terribly fraught, and I am very lucky in that in my case it wasn't. So I just really didn't have a kind of sense of like exposure either in my most intimate circles or in the broader world, if that makes sense.
Hello. Thank you. What a wonderful kickoff to this festival. I'm really interested in how you weave in work that sort of information, statistics, and whether there's a conscious decision that you make at what point you're going to weave those things in, and just how you work with that.
It's a great question. In case anyone couldn't hear it, the question was, how do you, or how do I guess, weave in the more kind of philosophical or information or idea-driven parts of the book with the memoir and the personal parts? And it's a great question because it really was one of a handful of really determinative writing challenges of this book, because I did know from the beginning that was how it was going to work, right? I always knew that, as I said, this was only kind of partly a memoir. In some ways, these very personal stories about my dad, about my partner, were just, I don't want to say a pretext, but they were functioning as anchors for these broader explorations. So I always knew that, you know, things like statistics about how many things we lose and theories about why we lose things, or very interesting, you know, mathematical ideas about how to search for things, you know, or stories about other kinds of discoveries, you know, terracotta warriors, or dinosaur bones in Manitoba, whatever it may be. I always knew all of that was going to be in here, and I was very mindful not wanting to create a kind of whiplash in the reader, like, oh, we're in this kind of book. Oh, whoops, wait, no, we're in a memoir. Like, what's happening here? And so I did put quite a lot of thought into how to balance those things so that it felt like the memoir and the broader reflections were pretty seamless. Not that we don't move out of one into the other, but that there was a kind of graceful baton handoff, and most importantly, it just seemed very clear that the ideas, when we were in these kind of thinky sections, it felt important that they were always serving the story, right? That the story, or vice versa, that the story was illuminating one of those ideas, so that, if we were talking about theories of how to search for something, then when we turn the page and I'm writing about being in my 30s and being single and not having been able to find love, I'm able to draw on those theories to think about, like, well, why is this such a hard problem, right? So yes, it did, probably more than almost anything else, it required a lot of care, including in these like technical ways of like, well, where does the section break in the book fall? Like, when do I move out of one kind of prose and back into the storyline? So yes, you're a very observant reader. That was a big part of trying to figure out how to make the book work.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody have one more question? Okay.
There are a lot of great things about this book, but one of them you mentioned earlier, which was sort of how you got to the organizing principles, because one of the things that really drives you is how the book is organized, and also that the end comes at the end. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I just said one of the difficult things about this book was trying to, balance this back and forth between more abstract or universal information and ideas, and then my personal story. Typically, the other huge challenge in writing a book or writing anything, as I'm sure any writer in the room knows, is structure, right? Like, it's one of the hardest things to figure out. The great gift of this book for me was that I knew the structure from the very beginning. This book, in fact, came into being. It became a book idea the minute this idea of Lost and Found kind of entered my head. And I knew right away, okay, I have an opening section that's an exploration of this very weird category of loss, and it's anchored in the story of the death of my father, losing my dad. And I have this mirror image section that follows that is an exploration of this equally strange and interesting category of discovery, all the things we find. And that one is anchored in a love story and the story of finding my partner. And then there's this third weird section, which, to be honest, again, this section, as strange as it may be, brought the book into being because it was immediately interesting to me, which is the and section that comes at the end, which I think came about because I did find my partner and lose my father in relatively quick succession. So I was already really thinking about the way that we don't ever get to experience these things in isolation, right? Believe you me, I would have loved nothing more than to have just fallen in love and reveled in the early stages of romance and all of the delight of that, and had my father just live another 35 years and be his death be totally unrelated. But we don't get to pick these things, right? Actually, there I was, newly in love, and my father is sick and my father is dying, and you're dealing with all of this at once. I had the chance to talk with the great memoirist Anne Lamott not long ago, and she said this wonderful thing I've been thinking about ever since, about how she really likes to keep her emotional silverware drawers separate, like the forks in the fork place and the spoons in the spoon place, but that's not life, right? And the forks and spoons of life are jumbled together, and I knew I wanted to write about that, and this idea of and was immediately very interesting to me, in a way that I think a lot of things are interesting to me as a writer, because I hadn't thought about it before, but right away I sort of recognized it as a defining feature of grown-up life. This is just, we all live with it in various incarnations all the time. You love your brother, but he drives you crazy, right? You adore your children, but you despise the ex-husband, but you wouldn't have your kids if you hadn't married him in the first place. We live with this kind of stuff all the time. So I knew I wanted to write about it, and I knew the and had to come at the end, which was sort of grammatically odd and yet kind of satisfying, because the whole point is the kind of lingeringness, right? It just does go on. There's in that sense, it's the epigraph to this book is this wonderful line by William James about how it's impossible to contain everything, and he says the word and trails along after every sentence, and I just think that's life, right? There's always something to say next. There's always something that's going to happen next, and to me that was such a beautiful idea, and so it felt right to end the book there, and I guess right to end this conversation there. So thank you for asking the question, and thank you guys all again so much for coming.